Michelle.
Daniel,
OG
OG Rose, and tonight we are going to talk about honesty because that is a fascinating topic. We only have about 45 minutes though because we have a bunch of obligations, but we were talking about this earlier and thinking it through, and it's really an interesting topic because it's one of those things that seems so obvious on what it means, but then when you start examining it, is it so clear? What's going on with the idea?
Yeah, I mean it's a I think there is it's tricky, right? Because it's kind of like, it seems very straightforward, and in some ways it is straightforward.
Sure.
To be honest, it is. But there's a degree to which you have to be discerning, about your audience. Is it the right time?
Mm-hmm.
Is it something that really involves the other person or not,
Oh, sure. And I think as parents, if your kid comes up to you and asks, what is terrorism? Do you really go into details on that? Or do you not? Is it unloving? What if they start having nightmares?
Yeah, and actually, it's like, Samantha Green, her amazing story, Blue Raspberry.
Oh, yes.
Is so good, and it really kind of explores that, especially with children, right? Like, do you tell them the truth? Is it honest? Is it not honest to kind of, those little white lies, just to kind of like sugarcoat things about the world so that it's not so harsh,
Right.
And so, anyways, it's such a beautiful story that Samantha wrote, and it does really shed light on the difficulty of that,
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, yeah, like we experience this question in a different way with
Sure.
having children.
Sure.
I think everybody does experience this, in their own fashion as well, whether it comes to, navigating different types of relationships, what's appropriate here versus there, and such things. So I think that if we don't talk about the topic, though, then it can become oversimplified, and maybe again, like I said, that's why it's tricky, because somebody could say, like, well, it is simple, you're just honest, you're just transparent, and it's like, yes and no. Like, yes, you do want to be transparent, but everybody knows that you wouldn't just, like, at your school go over the loudspeaker and start saying, like, some of the things that you would only tell your mom or something like
that's
that.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
You wouldn't. So it's like that. Then that means something. Like we can say that, like, there'd only be obvious examples, but it's never so obvious. It's never so clear, and that's what I think we're talking about in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, if that's your definition of honesty, full transparency, then God isn't honest.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Jesus isn't. He's given parables and not always defining it. I mean, Dante makes the point that God's hiddenness is necessary or else we'd be destroyed. It's like, Moses in the cleft of the rock, right? And so we all have a sense that there are some things that are appropriate to say at certain times versus others. And the issue is when you have like a mono value where you say, it's better to be transparent. Just be transparent. The problem with mono values is you don't have to think. Yeah. You don't have to discern. You don't have to be an active kind of assessing, and you don't have to take any risk. Because then if you just speak, you say, well, you're supposed to always be transparent, and it messes everything up or it causes a mistake. It's not your fault because you did what you're supposed to do. Right. So there's always a danger in the presenting of a value or an ethic as if it is self-evident and you should just do it no matter what, because that automatically means you don't have to think about it. Yeah. And whenever you don't have to think about something, you're dealing with a quote-unquote given. Yeah. And if it's a bad given, then it can cause the banality of evil. Hannah Arendt, thoughtlessness. Even good givens can do that. So we always should be skeptical of things that are just non-contingent.
Right, and another thing is that it can often be used as like, there can be a kind of like, obviously there's a way in which, like, of course it's a moral thing, right, of honesty, but there's kind of the moralization.
Yes.
In the negative sense, like if we think about this with Nietzsche or something, where like you get these principles, but you don't know why or what you even do with them, or why you're doing them, and then you end up just kind of, it's easy to fall into just thinking of becoming potentially self-righteous, not necessarily, and that's why it's a lot about just discerning your own heart on certain things. Certain things just kind of come down to a very personal kind of understanding of what that looks like for your own life. But what I mean to say is, like, that's the moralization of it in the risk, the bad aspect of it is that it can be weaponized.
Yes.
Maybe you already said that, kind of, but the concept is that like people can use it against each other when really they should be thinking how they should be being discerning about their own honesty.
Yes.
And like participating in that to the best of their discernment, and thinking about like what is honesty, because like you said, which is such a really important point, Jesus is telling parables.
Yeah. Jesus says it's not straightforward.
Yeah. You say the kingdom of God is near. What does that mean? Yeah. It's been, lots of hundreds of years. Like,
yes.
that doesn't mean that that's a lie. It just means that we have to really think about what it means to be honest.
Yes.
What does that mean? Yes. Interpretation will completely radically, destabilize what we think is honest, because people will interpret things very, very differently.
Yeah, he says don't put pearls before swine. I mean, he says many things. He's like, go away from them, shake the dust off your feet. Yeah. There's the contingency here. There's a discernment here.
Yeah.
And also, too, sometimes, when you say you should just be transparent, that can be used so I can control you, because if I know everything you're doing, then it can also be, well, you weren't transparent, so it's not my fault. And there's lots of... Now, on the flip side, people can use the you shouldn't speak also to avoid thinking, because you should just never speak, right? So you can also use the silence where, I'm just wise and smart because I don't
I'll never say anything, or I'll never share anything.
That's right. But then, of course, you moralize not speaking when you should then.
Exactly.
Right? So everything...
Yes, there's definitely a time to speak, absolutely.
Yeah, it's Javier's timing, right?
Exactly.
And the problem is, the problem is not more virtues or morals. The problem is, like, autonomous, non-contingent morals, where it's just presented as if you always do X, Y, or Z.
That's why I think that I bring up, Nietzsche and the moralization.
Yeah.
This is the kind of bad aspect of it. It's not, of course, it's good to have morals and virtues and ethics around these things, but it's this autonomous, like as if it is always just so black and white,
Yes.
And I think that something that, we talked about this the other day on the porch, but it's like there is something about there is a fine balance, and it's not something to be paranoid about. It's just to be aware of it. It has to do also with actually Javier's quotidian violence video and concept of like the fact that all language, there's an inherent violence in language, because you put something on someone that they didn't necessarily ask for.
That's right.
And so you really have to be aware of that. You have to be aware that, like you said on the porch, once you tell that person that thing, they can never unhear that.
Yes.
They can never unknow that. And so that's just very important. Again, it doesn't mean you never speak. You just get smart about, or I think you try to get smart about your audience, who you're talking to, what the timing is. Is that something that would really add value? Or is this, because a lot of times too, honestly, gossip, the honesty thought can ironically, I don't know if it's ironically, it's not really ironically, but it unintentionally can fuel idle chatter in a sense,
Absolutely.
Because, and I don't, but there is a way in which this idea of like, well, we're being transparent about things. We're being honest about the thing.
Yeah.
Well, what are you, or is it like maybe, and I mean only the person can ever really know, but what I mean to say is, and I can even just think about my own self, there's a way in which you have to really start thinking about what's really at the heart of why you're speaking.
Yes, that's right.
Because if you're being honest, but you're saying it out of a place of fear or boredom or
anger, irritation,
then it's like, so you kind of get, you have, you always talk about that, right? Like the virtues have to be in concert together.
Yes.
So you can't, if you're being honest, but you're also being angry.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, like you're yelling at the person. It's not wrong to be angry, but it's more so the fact that you're putting it on somebody else.
It depends. It always depends. Well, there's a few things. One, if you take the words and determinism paper where, once I ask you to go to the movie theater, you can never be in a world where you're not asked to go to the movie theater, and you have to confront that and risk making me upset by saying no or do something you want to do. Like every time we speak, we change the world. You put people in a world they can never go back from. And it's precisely that severity of language, that gravity of language, that means you should be discerning on when you speak. And simply saying transparency is good, it's good to always be transparent, is far too simplistic. It's far too simplistic. And we should always be skeptical of anything that does our thinking for us.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to make any discernment. Well, you're just transparent.
Well, it's kind of funny too, because with any type of autonomous, moralization, it's funny because it does in a sense do your thinking for you, but it also strangely doesn't provide any tools for what you actually would have to do.
Correct.
Like, that's the weird... Well, it does your thinking for you because it does cut out all that nuance, right? It just cuts out all of the, use this litmus test for this, that, or the other. It's like, just here's, you either do or don't. And, there can be the sense of like, well, if you don't, then, you're a bad person.
Yes, that's right.
And it's like, well, maybe it could be the case. That could be very, very true.
Yes.
It could also be true, though, that, that type of transparency is coming from a place of, again... not taking the time to think about like how does that change the dynamics of like the atmosphere, like that's is right. This and I do think it kind of always roots back to like the art form of conversation, which yes. we talk about a lot. Yes. And so I think it's just I think it is interesting because sometimes it takes like the ability to sometimes like to again just to discern when do you speak, when don't you speak, is like it does take a type of cultivation, and it can be hard yes. because if you just had the monolithic concept yes. of it, it would just be you could always just kind of rely on that. Well, I'm just able to do that, so you don't really, like you said, you don't really have to think. And if it does cause for some sort of like drama, you could just be like, well, I'm being honest,
yeah, it's not your fault. You're never
just being honest, and you hear people say that kind of, right?
Yeah.
Like,
well, a few times. One, if we're talking the art of dance or the art of music, there is a physical reality of which, if you don't have the skills, makes it undeniable you don't, right? But the problem with all metaphysical art forms like conversation is there's no facticity that forces you to acknowledge a skill was missing. So you can always say, it wasn't missing. I did what I was supposed to do. So the metric of a metaphysical skill requires the people to know about the metaphysical skill to judge it. And so then, of course, the problem is, if one does not have it, or is letting their ethics blind them from developing it, they have no ability to sense that something is missing. Yeah. They just think this is the way of things. Yeah. And that's why whenever you're dealing with quote-unquote metaphysical art forms or more invisible meta art forms, there's something, it's strange because if you don't, you almost have to get it to get it. Like, it's that, if you're in despair, you don't know you're in despair Kierkegaard thing. Well, also, like the metaphysical art, you have to get it to get it. So then, of course, how do you get it? And where does it come from? All those mysterious things.
And the hard thing, too, is, this whole idea of, like, you have to get it to get it. But even when you get it,
yes.
the hard thing is that people... when you don't do, when there's kind of this
yes.
sense of like, well, it isn't nuanced and like you're over complexifying
yes.
it, like, and maybe you're just trying to get out of being honest. So
yes. Yes.
then the kind of concept of getting it can look actually perverse.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's the hard. That's
really,
what
we were saying
really
on
part,
facing negativity, right? Like the shadow world looks good from the wrong, and it's all inversed and topsy turvy and all that. That's exactly right. The other thing that's interesting. So there's a few things. Also, often when people say you need to be transparent, they don't just say it in a vacuum. It's because they're upset. Like, it's usually like a power move. Like, you did something wrong, therefore, I have the step up.
Well, and that's why that's what I meant by the weaponizing.
Yeah.
It's and that's exactly it. That's exactly the wording I was thinking about in my head earlier. It's never in a vacuum, but it's treated as if it is. You know?
Yes.
A lot of times people are not honest because they were honest,
and they got
completely
exactly right.
shut down. They got completely demolished. That's a strong word, but they feel emotionally demolished or whatever.
So they don't speak.
So then they're like, nope, I'm not. And
then you get mad for not speaking. And you're like, why don't you speak? And it's very interesting how the person that demolished them last time for speaking often it doesn't click for them that the reason the person is not speaking. But that's you have to get it to get it. Like, if you don't see the dynamics or don't remember the dynamics, it's always interesting memory. And, we've talked about memory on numerous occasions, but like, when you go to Augustine, he's basically like saying to think, to get to all theology is memory based, like memory is the way to divinity. You just see all these things where, like, if you don't remember the dynamics, then you're like doomed. You're like stuck in this self-relating, like this snake eating its own tail. It's interesting, like having the ability to remember what led to what and what happened in the past, and maybe that's why the person's acting that way. If you cannot do that, it does almost feel like a kind of enclosure, a kind of damnation almost. And it's interesting to think of memory as being so critical. It certainly was for Augustine. But no, it's never in a vacuum. And the other thing that's important is when someone's like, I'm just being transparent, they're literally not telling you everything they did today. they're selecting. It's impossible to be transparent about everything. Right? So it's always selective as if it's not selective. And so it's like saying, well, these are just the facts. All facts are situated in a case. All facts are situated in a worldview. There are no facts in a vacuum. And so if you're saying these facts versus those facts, there's a reason you're saying X versus Y. Likewise, transparency always must be situated in the choice to be transparent about X versus Y, or else you're transparent about everything, and that's impossible. So transparency is never transparent.
Yeah. Do you think that we can kind of, not conflate, but we can kind of see those terms usually being paired together, honesty and transparency?
Yes, absolutely.
But absolutely. I think so too.
Absolutely. Now look, well, actually I think that's part of the sleight of hand, because honesty, if we're literally talking honesty, as in a situation where you are tempted because of you could gain something by lying and you don't lie, well, then honesty is always a virtue, if that's what we mean.
Yeah, exactly.
But what's happened is gradually honesty has come to be conflated with transparency, and transparency is much more weak. It's much more it's much more unclear.
It's much more unclear
as a principle. But you give it oomph if you conflate it with honesty.
Yeah.
Like honesty is when you're standing in the jury, you're standing on trial, and the lawyer asks X, and you know if you tell the truth, you're in trouble, or you're going to lose something, and yet you do it anyway. That's honesty, as a courtroom setting. But we're now using honesty regarding, small talk.
Well,
as if, and it's just, there's a mismatch here.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. That's like underline, highlight. That's really important. I think that's absolutely true, and I think that happens a lot. I think, too, that a lot of times people, there can be a... And this is where you see probably the conflation as well, where people are like, well, if you're withholding, then you're also lying. And I think there can be truth to that. Sometimes that is true, absolutely. And it depends on what type of relationship we're talking about, what's the timing, what's the audience, all of that sort of good stuff. But I think there can be risk to that, though, because I think about Jesus. Pilate's talking to him, literally asking him direct questions. He doesn't say a word.
Yeah.
He does at some point. He will answer indirectly.
Depends on which book.
Yeah, it depends on which gospel account you read. So it's either him answering indirectly, right, which could be considered a lie, right, or you get Jesus not responding, or at certain points not responding, and it's like, is he withholding the truth? He's not saying anything,
right?
And this happened too, throughout his ministry, where certain things where he would not, he would ask them questions, which is funny because he knows the answer, but he's out, so there's sort of, I guess what I mean to say is this whole concept of withholding that I think is tricky, because I think this is where it's conflated automatically.
Yes.
Just automatically, if you're withholding, it's almost as if you are lying.
Yes.
And I think that's not, I think that sometimes that would be true, that withholding is lying, but sometimes it is not true that it would be lying, because this is where the dynamics in the art form come into play, right? Yes. Where, and again, somebody might be like, well, just to ask that, that seems like a easy way out of having to, be forthright with something or something like that. But it's just, it does matter. It does matter, if you go through, what is the value add? What is, is this even relevant? Or is this something that happened 15 years ago? And I'm not saying that's not necessarily still something that should come to light or something like that. But it's just, to automatically conflate that is, I think, can be problematic, because then we don't get into the weeds of would this be the right time or not the right time? Would this be the right person to say it to or not the right person to say it to?
Well, there's a few things. If a Nazi comes in your house looking for Jews, and should you lie or tell them the truth? If you say it's okay to lie, okay, well, but then you can't have an autonomous, to
withhold the truth being lying in that case or something.
Well, if you say in that case it's okay to lie, so that the Nazis don't find, where the Jews are, well, then you've made an exception. And if in that case, then you have to work back and explain why some cases and not others. But let's say you're Connor someone, and you say, no, you can't even lie then. If you want to do that, really, what you would do following R.C. Sproul, he says what you would be doing in that case is saying that the Nazis have a right to the truth. And you're kind of honoring Nazism then by giving them the truth, right?
I always thought that was a great example that you've shared before.
And now the other flip side that the guy in that Justice lecture made is, you could say, I don't know where they are, And you go, because I literally don't know where they are because they may have moved by now. So you're looking for a middle ground between lying and telling the truth. But someone may look at that last one and say, well, that's actually a lie because you're looking for a way out, right? Yeah. You're looking for a loophole or whatever, right? Well, if there are all these different, I think it's quite clear that in that situation, the brain immediately says we should look for a way to avoid getting the Jews killed, right? Yeah. That's what your brain says, right? And so you're trying to automatically in that situation balance honesty and withholding as being good, right? Well, if there are situations where you can do that and think that that might be the wise move, it's an extreme example, but extreme examples are useful because they show the autonomous principle does not hold, right?
Right.
So the issue that often will happen, also too, when people say you're withholding, therefore you are lying, that's not true at all. It would completely depend. Like if the situation, but again, it comes to the courtroom. Like if you are in a courtroom and you are being asked, did you see this person steal from this other person's house?
Right.
And you don't answer, you are now withholding the truth.
Yes,
exactly. And it's
at and being asked directly is often a kind of like, well, you're being asked directly.
Yes,
that's
correct.
That would kind of be more so an example of okay, if you withhold the truth, then you, in a sense, are lying.
Yes.
So there are, like that. That's a
good.
But
what's happening is that all of this, like people are speaking as if we're in a courtroom. Like if you are in a courtroom and you are literally determining a case because of a fact, like literally something clearly bad occurred, like theft, like maybe murder or something. So there's no debate that the theft and murder occurred, right? So we're literally trying to figure out what actually happened based on an already agreed upon conclusion. What happens in these relational stuff when people talk about withdrawing or dishonest, people don't even agree on the result. Like people are like, it was wrong that you spent $500 at the store. I don't even agree with that premise.
Yeah.
Like there's people don't agree.
Well, that's the thing too. Is like, and this is what, to my point on hermeneutics.
Yes.
People have different interpretations of things. So to one the fact that like X is wrong in the first place is, this is going to be a sliding scale for people. Yes. And you can say, well, it shouldn't be.
Well, for the person of whom says it's clearly wrong, then in their mind it's a court case.
Exactly.
Therefore, withholding is lying.
Yes.
But for the other person, they say, no, this is not wrong, or this is not a big deal. Therefore, it's not a court case. Therefore, they have a right to withhold information in the same way that they do withhold information and not telling you every detail about every day that they always do.
Sure.
We are all withholding information. But to the person who thinks that what was done was wrong, in their mind, it's self-evident that they mean information relative to the case. Well, the other person doesn't even agree that there's a case. And
they may not even know that like, I did not know the spotlight was on my face.
That's exactly right. So the problem is you got one party that is a courtroom, the other person is not a courtroom, and so they don't agree. They don't agree on the terms. And that almost always happens when people start doing stuff like, well, withholding is lying. Like why would they make such a harsh case unless they think there's a court case going on? You know what I mean?
Right.
And they could be wrong about that. Often they are wrong about that. They just assume it because they're mad, they're irritated, something didn't go their way, and so they're using this ethical system to then put the other person in a place where they're very, very tempted to say, I'm sorry, you're right, I was wrong.
Yeah.
Very often in social dynamics, people are trying to get the other side to say sorry. Because if the other side says sorry, that means they've absorbed your interpretation of the situation. And once they do that, they've lost.
Right.
If you absorb my interpretation of the situation and my values and my valuation of it, well then you've lost automatically.
Yeah.
And so that's always the move people are doing, and they're often using these ethics precisely for that end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point. There were two things that came to mind. Well, I'll go to the one I remember right now. So, when we brought up about being honest, then the person was honest, but the other person completely, they were vulnerable, they were honest, and then the person just kind of, basically emotionally, damaged them,
wrecked them
in hearing that or whatever. Somebody might hear that and be like, well, yeah, that's hard, but they still have to do the right thing and be honest.
Yeah.
The thing is, I don't think that takes into account psychoanalysis. It doesn't take into account. I'm not saying it's true. Yes, we might just still be able to hold that and be like, yeah, well, it might be hard for the person because they got emotionally damaged, but they'd still have to be honest.
Yeah,
that's true. But the thing is, you can, it's undeniable that the person, there's an unconscious impact on that person because of that exchange.
Yes.
That went from the conscious to the unconscious and back and forth. And you have to realize that people, even if they don't want to, can often operate on those unconscious habits because they got hurt. Yeah, it's from truly, it's like truly like a survival. It's like a defense mechanism, right?
Yes.
It's a defense mechanism they may not even want to do, that they close off, for example.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
Is that okay? Is that right? No, not necessarily. But if you just make the person out to be a liar, they just further retreat. You can't. That does nothing. That just doesn't solve. In my opinion, I don't think that actually gets to the patterns, right?
But
I don't think that gets to. See, what's funny is like we're not even then being honest about the situation, you know, because
that's exactly right.
You know, and that's the weird thing about this.
Yes.
Is like. Again, that doesn't. The person still probably has the onus on working through their coping mechanism, but you have to take the context as a whole. You know, because people only ever have coping because they're having to respond.
That's correct.
Or they were responded to in a certain way, and it takes a lot of just being able to be, you know. And this came up in the talk that was so good today by Dr. Cadell last and Kevin Orson, I think his last name is, with like primal polarity. But basically the concept is just being self-aware, you know, being self-aware and also being willing to do the work within yourself.
Yes.
But, you know, people also have to give each other the grace to do that work and to be able to allow people to have that awareness, because a lot of times it's going to look like it requires a lot of like unpacking and, you know, letting the person do that to themselves. Because this is my other point that I was going to bring up, is that we often think about honesty and transparency in terms of like our relationships and stuff like that, like our, you know, talking to other people basically. But we also have to really get back to like, are we even being honest with ourselves, you know, or transparent with ourselves, and what does that look like? Because I think if we get so bent on it being like this completely only the social dynamic, which yes, it has its place and it's very important, yes, I understand that, but we forget this idea of being able to almost be able to learn how to gauge your, like, are you living out a lie or not? And that's going to impact you most of all, in terms of, and yes, then that will impact everyone else too. But what I mean to say is like, you're the only one who can kind of readjust yourself to get back into truth and toward truth. And even that kind of shift of like, wow, I'm living in lie, that has consequences, or that's going to make me feel really crap because I know that's whatever, that's, you know, I'm kind of living a lie in the sense that, you know, you might not be living in your own reality, or, you know, this is a lot of times, like, for example, let's take a very specific example. Say somebody has like an addiction, and it's like they have an alcoholic addiction. Okay, in a sense, what is a lie about that, quote unquote, is that would be the answer.
Yeah.
Right? It's actually very true that they like alcohol, or that they find comfort in it, that they find relief in it. All of that's actually true. This is the thing. There's both. There's always both at play.
Yes.
There's truth about that, but you know what the lie is? That would ultimately be able to solve their problem.
Sure.
Right? It will not. Alcohol will not. Another person will not. No. The only thing that's going to be able to really figure out and fix that problem is to be able to, the person being able to do the work within themselves, doing that inner work, that inner burning, like that inner, you know, struggle. That's right? Of ultimately like a sublational type of process. So I guess what I mean to say is there's always both at play. But that person living in this, you know, the lie that this would be the answer, alcohol, has to get that back. They have to shift themselves back to the truth, right?
Yes.
The truth of their own, you know, their own agency, their own ability to, you know, basically see the answer in themselves in a strange way. But I think that is actually true. So yeah, all of that to say, the idea of like living out truth, right? Living out honesty in the sense that you live in truth. That to me, I think is very important. I think that gets completely absconded. I don't know what that word is. Yeah.
Obfuscated.
Yeah.
Obfuscated, or whatever it is. Yeah. Big word.
Big word.
Yeah, I can't even say it.
I can't say it either, but I say it in my head.
Yeah.
But yeah, the long and the short of it is, I think it gets completely overlooked, like in the sense that it doesn't ever get really. We don't cultivate maybe the most core aspect of what honesty really is, because we only ever think about it in terms of like, are you saying enough or saying the right things, or you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
I think that can be problematic. Okay, well, that was a tangent.
Few things.
Sorry.
Few things. First off, I think it's very true that often people's demand for the honesty of people sacrifices the quote-unquote honesty of the situation. Like, the situation is not able to shine forth, almost like Heidegger's being, because everyone's demanding everyone else to be honest. Yeah. And so you can't get to the situation to thus discern the situation. And the reason why that tends to occur is because when you demand people to be transparent, you're assuming they can be transparent. Most people are, like, self-deceived. They don't remember everything perfectly. They have different interpretations. Like, we just say, well, just be transparent. Say everything. It's like, people can't. That's not so simple. Like, they don't remember. They like this whole, like, just be transparent. Well, when in a courtroom... you probably can be transparent because you probably do remember watching the person steal from that house because that was a vivid, undeniable event that got seared in your memory. So when someone in a courtroom wants you to be transparent, the very fact you're in that courtroom means it's about the thing that's probably seared on your memory. Yeah. But when people are asking you to be transparent about, like, daily activities or random things that are irritations to them but not to you, your mind doesn't latch on to these things like it latches on for them. So you may not be transparent about it, not because you care, but because your brain just doesn't remember. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole, like you were saying, you brought up psychoanalysis. That demand for transparency completely ignores all of the complexities and intricacies of how the human psyche works. As if we are just able to, like, open our brain and close our brain. And everything is there, and all we gotta do is open it or close it. And if we don't open it, it's because we closed it. And it's simple as that. And if you loved me, you'd be open. There's much more complicated dynamics at play that are completely ignored. And frankly, the person almost has incentive to ignore them because it's a power move. It's like the game, with Ethan Nelson, we talked about the game theory dynamics of conversation and power dynamics and power strategies and different things. Like, if I tell you to be transparent, I have the upper hand. There's power. I have control. You can't be a threat to me because you've already been, debunked, right? So there's power also at play, and there are reasons people seek power: to be shielded, to have control, to make sure that you're okay, so on and so forth. And there are other things too, like you said, how people withdraw when you get upset about them, and then they withdraw and they withdraw and they withdraw. Well, then horrifically, that almost functions as evidence that the person who didn't trust them or who thinks they're withholding something was right to think that, because the person then withholds more. See, I knew it.
Oh yeah, so it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it becomes a self-relating negativity. It becomes very, very difficult to escape. Yeah, extremely difficult to escape because someone can't be honest about falsity. Mm-hmm. You're asking them to tell the truth, but your framing of the situation is false. So you're asking them to be honest about something false, which they cannot do. Mm-hmm. And so that situation must be a self-relating negativity unless they confess the lie. But now the snake has eaten itself. Now you're done. Well, now you're going to enter the self-relating negativity of trying to live according to a lie. Mm-hmm. And that's another self-relating. So you just can never leave. You're stuck.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, like, I think too, something that I probably have learned more so from, like, living more in the country, to be honest, is like this concept. And at first I was kind of like, I think there are definitely different cultures even within the same country. Like there's 100%. Very, very different cultures even within the same country. Even within the same state, because the state can have different. There can be more rural areas, more country, more city-like areas. And so something that, I didn't really quite understand at first, and I was kind of like, I don't know if I like that. But I said that, it just kept that in my head, like this. Sure. I'm like, I don't know if I like that. But now but I was like, wait. That might not be what I usually do, but maybe there's something to that. So let me just wait it out and now it's like, wow, I really understand this so much more now. And it's like, yes, I see why this is actually very important. It's like this idea that if you need to know, somebody will tell you. Yes. And if you don't, you may not be told, but that's okay, because you don't necessarily need to know. You may need to know, but you may not need to know. Yes. And I think there's just something very important about this, because what it requires? Trust. Yep. And I think you have to ultimately trust. Like, ultimately, your most valuable relationships will require you to trust. That's trust. Right. And that's good, because that actually allows for a lot of freedom in that relationship, in terms of, like, the freedom of just being able to just be at ease, because you know that you can trust the other person and they can trust you, And so, like, this, I think this is important, because if somebody doesn't tell you something, there's probably a reason.
Yes.
And you know, you have to trust them with that.
Yes.
Like there might be some very, you know, if only you could, you know, it's like if you knew, then you're like, oh wow, I see why you didn't like.
And now I can't unknow.
Now I can't know it. Yeah.
I can't unknow it.
So you know what I'm saying? So it's like if the person didn't tell you, there's a reason they didn't tell you. If they did tell you, there's a reason they told you.
Yes.
That's the other part about it. There's a reason why they told you.
Yes.
You know, and just trusting them, trusting either way, and not to take it like personally one way or another, because for some cultures to be told is like, you know, the intimate thing, but to not be told some certain thing because maybe it was traumatic would be the intimate thing. You see, like it just revolves depending on
everything,
depending
on situation,
depending on the family culture or the you know.
And then it's a question of bearing fruit. Where's the fruit?
Yeah. But what I mean to say is like you can't just simply go, well, you know, because this is what we talked about in Portugal, but too, like, you know, intimacy equals transparency, because it's like, well, okay, well, what do we mean by transparency? You know, and sometimes there could be even a greater intimacy and trust in literally the trust of you know, I trust that person. If they tell me, they need me to know. If they don't need me to know. And to trust that, because you know what, ultimately you still have the relation. You can still relate to each other about just the relation, you know, like that relation is not hinging on you necessarily knowing that thing. No. But you know, if it did, or if you needed to know, you would know that thing. But you know what the relationship always will hinge on is that trust.
Completely.
You know,
well,
you know what I'm saying? Like I think people put it's almost like the fundamental of trust gets somehow replaced. It's like a bait and switch for transparency itself, which kind of is very hard, because it can also feel insatiable. Like, how do you know? Insatiable. How do you know? Is it enough? Is it enough? Is it enough? Is it enough? Is it enough?
It is
and
insatiable.
And you can get kind of like, there can be fear that's really.
It tends to be fear.
It can be steeped in, you know.
Transparency is a threat to trust.
Yeah.
There is no trust where you know.
That's interesting, Daniel. That's a good point. That's a snap point.
So when you got all these people basing a relationship on transparency, they're basing it on the very thing that destroys relationship. Relationship is only possible with trust. And so this move now in society where relationship are about transparency is exactly anti-relationship. It's very dangerous. And it's no different. It's like the simplistic thing where you say, well, everyone wants, you know, you should always give people a choice, right? You know, freedom's always good. Often you can give people choices because you don't want to make the choice. Right. You don't want to be responsible. Yes, there are things where you should give people a choice, but there are also times where you're giving the choice to other people because you don't want to make it. You don't want to be, and now you put the torture on them. Yeah. Right? And so nothing is so simple.
Yeah.
You know, transparency, like you should absolutely be transparent. Like, I know this person needs to know this, but I don't want to tell them. Well, you need to be transparent, per se.
Exactly.
And actually, though, here's the thing. It's very difficult to think of a single time when transparency is what you should do that doesn't also actually involve trust, funny enough. Like, if there's something I need to tell you but I don't want to tell you, then I need to trust that you'll respond well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So when you're just doing transparency for transparency's sake, this is very dangerous, because even though maybe it's harmless 99.9% of the time, when it's not, it can be utterly dire and start getting you in a self-relating negativity. So you have to ask, like, it's far better to ask questions about fear, wisdom, discernment. Once you start saying, am I being transparent or not? That's too vague of a value to organize action.
Yeah.
You know, it's just not clear enough.
Yeah.
Because, and also too, like, the big thing is, like, transparency is a threat to trust.
Right.
Like, how can a person show you that they love you other than to be given a chance to do something in freedom, unknown, or to not demand to know something? It's, you know, to create that space of unknowing is an opportunity for love to show its meaning.
Yeah.
Now, not always, but you see, this is why it's just completely useless to have principles like it's good to be, like, to assert transparency is always good, because it depends.
Now the thing is, people might be like, when we have more epistemological, which I know is maybe strange, I guess all conversation is kind of epistemological.
Sure.
But I do think that another reason why this probably, I'm trying to think why this might happen, is because a lot of times people's conversation is merely kind of just fact exchange.
Yeah. So they feel like you're denying facts.
So when they say, like, well, but if we don't have if you're gonna, like, if you're going to put trust before transparency, how would you even talk? You know,
no,
like
that's 100%.
people are like, well, because there's other things you could talk about.
You can talk about ideas.
You know,
but that's exactly, that's
you know, and it's you can still talk about, and you know what, idea talk will bring up things that are your own personal details. You will bring those things up with those people who you talk about ideas with, because it's related to those ideas, and it's also because usually when you talk about ideas with people, that is a type of trust relationship, right?
Completely.
You have this and it's very wonderful. It's wonderful because it feels very much a place where the funny thing is when you put trust first over transparency, you feel more at ease to be transparent. But if you put transparency first,
you lose both.
You're like, you don't feel as like it's as much of a trusted space to be able to be transparent, because you're like, will this be enough? Is this not enough? Is it enough? Is it too much? Is it not enough? It's like you know?
Well, whenever you put second things first, you lose both in something that's insatiable. Because you know, in Christianity, evil has no substance, so it's insatiable. Exactly. Because there's nothing there to stop eating, because there's nothing there. So it goes on forever. There's nothing there to make satiated. The thing is, I don't think it's by chance that you tend to have extrovert cultures demand transparency, because they want facts to keep talking.
Yep, exactly.
And but then they become undiscerning. Because they are so worried about not having something to talk about. And so there's a pathology that develops that needs to be addressed. In the same way that the person who's always silent has a pathology of they're afraid they're going to say something wrong and something bad happen. And they have to face that. So I think that culture, like the extroverts, you know, Susan Cain talks about America as an extrovert society, so on and so forth. I think that tends to go with the thrust of transparency. But then the irony is that you end up losing both, because then the person, you know, doesn't want to be there. The other thing that happens is when transparency emerges organically in a conversation about ideas, then the structure and context by which that transparency is situated is also created at the same time. So it doesn't tend to create unintentional consequences, because there was a conversation of ideas to make clear why this is being shared and what it means. But when you're just transparent without any intellectual scaffolding, it's more likely to lead to unintentional consequences, and so on and so forth. I mean, the other big thing too is the reason why this transparency stuff is so problematic is because it suggests that there are no virtues in not sharing something. And not sharing something can be just as hard and frankly harder than sharing something. Like if you are ill and you are hurting or sick, then you are actually, in a way, if you don't tell everyone that, it can be an act of virtue, because you are gifting them with not knowing that, so they don't have to respond to it. And also you are training yourself to be the kind of person who is able to hold that and to just take it to the Lord or not complain about it, right? There is virtues in not sharing. It's in the same way that, like, now, you know, that masculine virtues without feminine virtues are poisonous, but also feminine virtues without masculine virtues are poisonous. Likewise, extrovert virtues without introvert, you know, those terms are very general, but if we use them here, extrovert virtues without introvert virtues are poisonous, and vice versa. And so there are absolutely virtues, and you know, like, it tends to be that men generally will be on the side of, I will keep this within and not share it because this is my gift to the family. Like, I am not going to put this on the family or other people. I'm just going to deal with it. Now, the danger with that is if a male tries to do that, but they also haven't done, say, the training or the character training or the philosophical training to do that without it manifesting unintentionally, say, in alcohol or something, well, then that's no good. But even if that mistake is made, the impulse, the intuition that there's a good in that is not inherently wrong. In fact, that intuition can have a lot of good to it. But I don't think also that this screaming for transparency, it's also emerged in our Instagram cell phone world, where everyone can always seek information or learn more. Which then when you encounter, since you're so habituated to always learning and everything being transparent to you, when someone's not transparent, it goes against your it goes against the habitus of your days. Like the habitus, your daily environment of habits. And so it goes against it. So this is clearly wrong, because the entire zeitgeist of the world is constantly transparent, and this person isn't transparent, so they must be in the wrong. And so there's actually a kind of indirect mob mentality that forms as well. And of course, if to take it one more level up, I think the government, frankly, loves everyone to think that transparent. It's easy to collect data. It's easy to have algorithms. If everyone's transparent about everything all the time, then you can inspect. Then they're just going to do that over the phone. They're just going to do that over Instagram, and they collect data. So, the doctrine of transparency also probably contributes to capture by the state, by the corporations and everything. So they love it as well.
Yeah. And I think too, like, I think that was all very good and very true. And I think that, I think it's hard not to, think about like the totalizing ear on this being like, okay, so you like never, share anything,
That's right.
No,
and I want to note that
the
use of the word never is always a power move.
Absolutely.
And people do it all the time. So what are you saying? We're never like it's a power move. Right. Never. There is no never. Yeah, never's never.
I think the main thing though is like to me it is actually about the trust, where it's like this isn't so much about saying like you should or shouldn't.
Sure.
No, the point of the matter is that there's timing to certain things, and
it's
also
timing.
And the thing is, if you don't necessarily agree with that, to still trust that maybe somebody else has a different perspective on sharing, right? Or they might use a particular type of discernment on sharing, or they might share it in this context but not in this context or something. And to not take that, it just there can be such a like almost like taking personally, what somebody else does or shares or doesn't share, and it's almost like, again, this sort of can reveal, like you're saying, the zeitgeist of the age, and what we do just have to be aware of is that there is both there are virtues in sharing, there's virtues in not sharing, depending, So,
well, I mean,
I think that's a good way to, the state,
the quote unquote state benefits from everyone pressuring one another as such. Because then everyone's like, if you take it personally, if I'm not as transparent as you think I should be, well, then that's going to put me in a situation where I might feel bad about it, and then I become more transparent, and thus the state gets more data for the algorithms.
Yeah. I always think it's interesting, too, because a lot of times to the idea conversation concept is like, it's funny because, so if people think like small talk is where the transparency, that's the level of where transparency is, somebody could be talking about very kind of deep, like long things that they've been, basically gestating for years in terms of their ideas and their own philosophy, and they're being open and they're being like, I'm being very transparent. I'm telling you like some of my deepest thoughts on reality, but that doesn't count because it's not small talk. So therefore, you're not being transparent. It's like you have to realize somebody could be extremely transparent, just not in terms of the language you're thinking to hear or want to hear. You know what I'm saying?
That happens all the time, and that's what we're saying. Where like when your demands of transparency are always situated within schemas and hermeneutics,
languages, basically, It's like somebody could be speaking, like they're being completely transparent, but they're speaking a different language. And so to you, you're like, wow, they're being super secretive. Look, they're even speaking in code. But but they're actually just speaking in it. So everybody else who speaks that person's language, I was like, oh no, they're actually really being transparent right now.
And for them, when you're just talking about your feelings or whatever, you're hiding. That you're not being transparent because that doesn't count for them. So that's the key. Like, but this also suggests. And I know we have to close because of everything. But this also suggests why I think it's a strong argument that trust is more fundamental. Like, it's not a matter of debate. People say, well, in your world, trust is more fundamental, and in my, transparency is more fundamental. I think I don't think it's the case. I don't think it's a matter of taste. Trust is more fundamental. Well, let me put it this way. Nothing can function without trust.
Yeah.
Things can function with less transparency. But, like, trust is more fundamental than transparency. Now, no transparency means the government takes over because they're not transparent. Exactly. And no transparency means there can be devastation. But entire transparency as well destroys trust. And then that's a surveillance society, right? Yeah. And so that happens in relationships. We create surveillance society. So you have to be discerning.
Yep,
you have to discern in an active thinker. And basically that's the rub. It just will not do to have simple generalities where you say it's always good to be transparent and to get upset at people if they're not as transparent as you think they should be, because maybe they just discern the situation differently. And often, funny enough, sometimes people will get upset that people weren't transparent, where had they been that transparent, the person would have been worse off. Like,
or they'd be like mad. It's like, tell me what you really think, and the person does, and then they're like, now my feelings are hurt.
Yes.
You
Yes.
see like funny memes about that or whatever. It's
Oh,
just like,
absolutely.
Can you handle the truth? Like that's, you know what I mean? There's an element too where, yeah, we can't determine, nor should we determine if what another person can handle, but we should be aware that words matter, right?
Yes.
Words are
Yes.
a type of violence inherently, in an ontological way. And so in that sense, like we have to kind of be, we just have to kind of be aware of that. And like you're saying, the person can demand something that they wouldn't actually want. They want what they don't, they want what ultimately they wouldn't want. And that's psychoanalytical.
Absolutely.
And that's absolutely.
Well, I mean, the only things that can be transparent are finite because they're there to be shown. Infinite things can't be so transparent. They have to be transcendent. So there's always like a risk of sacrificing transcendence for transparency. Transparency is horizontal. Transcendence is vertical. And if you too much emphasize the transparent, then you're going to see right through the transcendent.
Well, that's the funny thing. That's a really great thing to highlight about the words. That's wonderful. That's really, really good. And I think about it like you can only actually ever really be transparent with veils. Like
Yes.
like you have varying degrees of the layers that can be transparent. But if all of it was transparent, it would just be you couldn't even discern it, right? You couldn't even discern it. And that's where, like, in a sense, I guess all transcendence has this kind of unseen quality
but this
to
is
that.
This is the ordering.
Yeah, it's the
Transparency must be what the transcendent gradually is unveiled to you through, not transparency replace the transcendent. And the transcendent requires trust.
Yeah.
And you see, the more the veil is moved away, the less the mystery go. The mystery is lost. And so the problem is we have to see transparency in time. In timing, in due time. You will know when you need to know. You will find out when you're ready for it, when it's appropriate. And so in that, like, God will unveil himself when you can handle it and in the way that is appropriate. But transparency can never be an end in of itself, because if it is, it replaces transcendence. It must always be the gradual means by which transcendence is unveiled in a manner that does not at the same time ruin the trust in that transcendence. Yeah. And right there we have a balancing act that has to be discerned. We have a dance that we have to be open to, not stomp our feet and demand it go our way.
Yeah. That's good. Well, for more,
by OG Rose,
you can go to Instagram, Facebook, Twitter.
Oh, the website, yes. YouTube.
www.ogrose.com.
I guess you can use the hyphen as well. And
it's true.
OG.
Trying
to be transparent about all the possibilities.
ROC.
And
SE.
different things. And thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you.